Hey everybody, I figured that because I did the unboxing video of Forever and a Death, and because I'm a big James Bond fan and a big Donald Westlake fan, I figured I'd come back and do a bookend of that here and do a sort of a quick overview review, because I just finished reading Forever and a Death. Trying to see how, I finished it this afternoon. That's pretty quick for me. This is a 460 page novel, and I read it between Wednesday or Thursday and Tuesday of the next week, so that's pretty fast. I don't think Jared has finished it yet, and I don't think John has even had a chance to start it yet. So we will be doing a full On Her Majesty's Secret podcast episode where we talk about it. That'll be coming up as soon as they're both done and able to get online. But I didn't want to wait that long to give my initial impressions of it, because I'm afraid that by that point I'll have kind of forgotten some things, and I won't be as enthusiastic about it obviously as I am right now, the day that I just finished it. So I'm going to try to hold back on the spoilers, maybe at the very end. If I have some spoilers, I'll give you a spoiler warning. The alarms will go off before I say anything that might spoil any part of the book that you haven't read. But just to kind of recap what this is, and I don't want to beat the dead horse to death too much, because if you're watching this, you probably already know, but this is Donald E Westlake's final published book. It was not published during his lifetime. He died about 9 years ago, I guess. And Hard Case Crime, Charles Ardai, who they put out a lot of really great stuff, including a good bit of Westlake's older stuff. They put out a lot of, obviously, crime fiction, but it's more pulp crime fiction. It's not like Michael Connelly involved convoluted legal stuff and Harry Bosch and all. It's more like they put out, old and new stuff from a variety of sort of hard-boiled authors. And so it was interesting that this would come along, because it was totally billed and promoted as the lost James Bond movie of 1997. Like, this was supposed to be the story for the 1997 Bond, the second Pierce Brosnan Bond, but of course instead we got Tomorrow Never Dies. Now, the first thing I want to say about it, and I'm going to probably repeat some of this on Her Majesty's Secret podcast episode when we do it, but I'm just going to go ahead and use some of my stuff, some of my lines, and some of my observations now as well for you guys to see early. It's not, having read it, it's not a James Bond story at all. The only thing that it has in common, and it's what I think what he took out of it's based on a story treatment, not a lost script. Westlake was approached by people working with Eon, with the Bond people, to do a story treatment, and he did several iterations, several different versions of a story treatment for a James Bond movie script, but he never wrote a script. He just kept coming up with basically it was like a 35-page story treatment, and then a 9-page story treatment whittled down a bit and everything. So he had some of the basic ideas to work with here, but he never developed it beyond that. So circumstances, which I'm not going to go all into, circumstances caused him to have to not do it. They went a different direction. They ended up using the script that they used with Wei Lin and with Elliot Carver, and with the character played by Terry Hatcher, and so on, and Stamper, and all that stuff. I love it. I love Tomorrow Never Dies. I really do. It's one of my favorite Bond movies. It would have been neat to see a Donald Westlake Bond movie, but as one reviewer noted, and I read a really good review. I'll try to put it in the show notes when I post this. But one reviewer I read, who didn't give any spoilers, but he had some background information I thought was good, pointed out that this, and I agree, that this isn't, it's not a Bond it's not. It's more about what normal people would have to do facing a Bond villain. In other words, look at the cover. Here's my first critique. I don't mean anything. Let me say up front, I enjoyed it. I blew through it. I liked it. I'm glad I read it. But look up front on the cover copy. Sorry, it's all backwards to me. It says, "A fortune in stolen gold, a device that will kill millions, and just one man can stop it." And the cover dress, the painting, has a very Bondish looking, he's blonde, but he's a very Bondish looking guy in front of the Bond girl. Well, here's the thing. She's in it. I don't think she ever holds a gun, but she's in it. Orange swimsuit and all. Scuba suit. There's nobody really like this in the book. Instead, there's probably 4 or 5 characters, any one of which at some point could be this guy, but never. All right, well, look at this. A fortune in stolen gold, yes, that's in it. A device that will kill millions, yes, that's in it. And just one man can stop it? Charles. Hard case. Charles Ardai. Really? This book is virtually the opposite of just one man can stop it. Again, I don't mean that in a bad way. It's kind of a neat way. But what this book says is that there are Bond villains out there. This guy's a Bond villain, the main character. In fact, he's the most developed character in the book. But there's no James Bond. So you have a number of characters. Jerry, Luther, Manville, Kim, Fairchild, I think his name is. I mean, there's a number of characters that at one point or another, Mark, at one point or another, do something to try to stop the Bond villain, okay? And I won't tell you how it works out, but it's never one man can stop him. Never. That's the farthest thing. It's the opposite of that. So if you go into this, see, I saw one reviewer. Well, that's another complaint. There's only 4 reviews up on Amazon. I'm going to have to add mine now. One reviewer said I sent it back after like the first 20 pages because it didn't grab me and all that, and it's boring. I'll agree that the beginning of it is kind of slow. This is a long, drawn-out book, and because it doesn't have that one Bond-type hero, and it doesn't, because of that, it makes the beginning choppier and more uneven and slower. The only character that really gets developed in the first 50 to 100 pages really is the villain. And the villain's very interesting. And again, somebody made a very interesting observation. They said that in Donald Westlake's world, the villain is always more interesting. So it makes sense that he would put more development into the interesting villain than into any of the heroes. You don't have a Bond hero that's this one really fascinating hero that's going to come in and save the day. So he has several kind of, not really 3-dimensional, kind of 2-dimensional, maybe 1-dimensional heroes and helpers that work against the main villain. Now, it held my attention, and after about, and I know this is going to sound weird, but this is a 450-page book. There's an afterword at the end by one of the Bond Eon people kind of explaining everything, and that's cool. But the first 450 pages is the story, and it takes probably 50, 60, 70 pages to get going. But it really does get going after that. So if you're only casually interested in it, you may not be interested, you may not want to read it at all. If you're really into it, then trust me, it's going to pick up a good bit after the first section or so. It's divided into like 4, 5, 6 books. It picks up after the introduction pretty well. There was something else I was going to mention. So yeah, the cover description is only partially accurate, and in fact, I would argue that part of the cover description is outright deceptive, and that I was not happy about that. As you're reading like the first 50, 60 pages, as I was reading the first 50, 60 pages, I kept trying to every time a new guy character would be introduced or come on the scene again, right? I kept trying to figure out, is this the one man? Is this the Bond character? Is this the character that Pierce Brosnan would have played if this had become, the movie? No, there never is that character. It rotates through a whole supporting cast of sort of B characters, but you never get an A hero. Okay, so you understand that. Now, another thing I want to mention is the title, Forever and a Death. That's a very Bond-sounding title. I have no idea if that was Westlake's title he came up with, or whether that was a hard case crime title they came up with now, or if that's the title Westlake came up with later just for this book, but not for the original Bond movie. But I'll say this. This title has virtually nothing to do with the movie. I mean, at least most of the Bond movie titles have something to do with the story, even if they have to squeeze it in like A View to a Kill did. That was probably the weakest, right? They squeezed it in. Great View to a Kill. I mean, that was like the worst one. But Forever and a Death, I mean, I was thinking this afternoon, how would I justify, if I were the publisher, how would I justify calling this book Forever and a Death? And here's the only thing I could come up with. Because it's a 450-page Westlake book, and I'm used to his books being the little Parker thin books, then I was thinking, you know what? It takes forever to get to the end of this, and then there is a death. Several, in fact. So, forever and a death. Other than that, I mean, you could have called it almost anything. You might have called it Hong Kong Strike. I mean, I don't, it's stupid, but I've been trying to think of a better name, and maybe it was a good thing they went with Forever and a Death, because I can't think of anything better, and it sounds very Bondy, and it just doesn't have really any connection to anything in the story. Again, one reviewer pointed out that Westlake did like Bond to a certain degree, and probably liked the Bond villains more than he did James Bond, and particularly Goldfinger. And there's a little bit of Goldfinger in this. Imagine Goldfinger if instead of Sean Connery's Bond, you'd had 5 mid-level characters going up against Goldfinger, none of them more prominent than Felix Leiter. Okay? And each one doing a little bit to defeat Goldfinger. That's this story. All right. So it's very well written. I love Westlake's writing. Westlake is very good at, especially for a writer who admittedly, who he himself admitted, he would he kind of came up with a premise and then just wrote through what he called narrative force, the pacing, until he played out the story. And the thing that I, as a writer, have found about that kind of writing is you don't get very many plot twists and turns with that kind of writing, because you really have to set plot twists and turns up in advance. So if you're going to write a story just straight ahead, no plotting, no outlining, and just, come up with a premise, come up with the characters, and then just go to the end, you've got to be willing to do second and third drafts where you go back and put things in earlier that set things up, right? Like, let me just make something ridiculous off the top of my head up, right? Let's say that late in the book you want the villain to be eaten by tigers, and you want it to be that he's terrified of tigers, so when he sees the tigers, he loses all reason, drops his gun and runs, and the tigers run him down and eat him. If that's one of your big twists at the end, then in like chapter 3 or 4, you need to make a point about how the villain is sitting there thinking of how when he was a kid, a tiger scared him to death, right? I mean, that's a very stupid analogy, a stupid comparison or example, but you get my point, right? That if you're going to if you're going to have something meaningful happen later, you've got to set it up earlier. And it's hard to do that unless you do it in second or third drafts. It's easier nowadays with computers, but back in the day with typewriters, it was really difficult. Okay, so Westlake has maybe 3 or 4 moments, big moments in the book, in like the last quarter of the book, in Act 4, basically, right? Westlake has several moments in it where he actually hits us with something, and you refer back and you go, oh, okay, that's why he was talking about that in Chapter 8, was because in the equivalent of Chapter 60, it pays off, right? So there are several moments like that, but not a whole lot. A lot of it is very straight ahead. In fact, I found myself really appreciating the moments where the henchman, the evil henchman, had a little character development and depth, because you don't really get that in a James Bond story, right? The henchmen are very one-dimensional. They come on, they do their trick, like throw their hat with a blade or bite the cable car with their metal teeth or whatever. Bond henchman villains, they do their trick, their stupid human trick, shall we say, and then they're gone. They're off screen, or they're killed by Bond or whatever. So I think that the best characters, honestly, in this book, the villain, the main supervillain, he gets some good development and attention. He gets a lot of attention. He probably has half the chapters in this book, which is way more than a Bond villain ever gets in a movie. But I think the real gems in this book are the henchmen, because there's 2 or 3 henchmen that come along throughout it, and Westlake takes the time to develop them, to give them some personality, to give them some backstory, to give them some things that make them interesting beyond just doing their trick. Okay. So if anything I think is really worth your time in this book, it's the development of the henchmen. There's one of the sort of secondary level heroic characters that you start thinking is the hero, and then he kind of gets abandoned for a big chunk of the book. So he, at one point you're thinking, oh, this is going to be the James Bond guy, and then he's really not. He gets totally abandoned for a while. So the only character that carries through from beginning to end is really the villain. All right, so I guess let me do a little spoiler section at the end, but first I'll give a summary. I think that really, on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of just books I would read in general, I give this a 7. I think on Donald Westlake's 1 to 10 scale, with like the best Parker books being a 10, I would give this, maybe a 6. And should you, if you like the kind of stuff I like, should you read it? Would you read it? Yeah, I'm not sorry I read it. I'm glad I read it. I'm disappointed in the sense that I was expecting a James Bond story, because on the back it says the Bond that never was, and I would add, and still isn't. It's not great, but it's not bad. It is worth my time. I got it for like what? It's a retail $22.99. I got it for about $16, $17 on Amazon. Delivered the day it came out. So that was worth it. I got several days of enjoyment out of it. So I'll give it a conditional thumbs up. Okay. Woot. Spoiler. Let me talk just a little bit about spoilers. I was disappointed that Manville didn't end up doing more. He was the guy I thought was probably going to be the Bond character after a while, even though he was kind of learning on the go. I did like that he was reading a Richard Stark book, I think it was, to kind of learn how to be a tough guy. Several of his scenes were very good. I liked him, doing the action stuff, even though he really didn't know what he was doing. His escape was cool. His getting Kim off the ship before that was pretty cool. I enjoyed all of that. The premise they set it up with, that Westlake set up with for the villain, is actually a neat idea. I don't know if this Soliton thing actually works, but I'll say this: I looked it up, and hotels either do use the underground water cooling, or they're working on it, and particularly Hong Kong. So watch out, Hong Kong. You could have a Richard Curtis sailing up your tunnels one day. I liked the ending for the villain, particularly because he kind of does it to himself through his own greed. In other words, instead of having a heroic character defeating him on the little submarine, he just kind of does a couple of dumb things without thinking, and basically kills himself. So that was pretty cool, I thought, too. So, beyond that, I thought that in some places it read like it was a 1960s or 70s book. I thought that Kim, right up until the end, when she gets a chance to do the heroic thing, Kim is basically just a damsel in distress. There's the one moment where she sprays the hairspray on the odd job guy, and that was, the big heavy thug guy that comes to get her, like Odd Job would. And that was neat. But, I mean, she really does three things. She jumps in the water, nearly gets herself killed. She fights off the bad guy in the hotel room. And then she goes in the water to save the day from the big explosion. Other than that, she has a couple of, sex scenes with Manville. And that's about it. So Westlake's background in being kind of a 60s, 70s writer, I think, shows there in that he made her kind of a damsel in distress going, eek, eek, oh, where is Manville, I can't ever think of his first name. There's a terrible name in this. The name of the gay bar. I'm not even going to tell you what it is. And this is the spoiler section, because I don't want to say it. But go back and look again at what the gay bar is called and think about it. Wow. Okay. Way to go, Westlake. That's no. But other than that, I think I'll wrap it up. I think probably the most effective scene in the whole book was the interrogation of Jerry by the odd job guy, Colin, whatever his name is. I also liked the flunky on the boat that came to kill Kim. I can't think of his name either. He was the American that was kind of a thug, later pretended to be Manville when they called him in Singapore. Oh yeah, and that was the other thing. I'm a big Singapore fan. I mean, I lived there for a while. I love Singapore, and it was neat to read about Orchard Road and the marina and the cleanliness and the fines and all that. There was a lot of really good stuff like that in it that I appreciated. So, okay, well, I'm gonna wrap up for now. That was Forever and a Death by Donald E Westlake, a great writer who we all miss. I think instead of spending much more time thinking about this book, I'm going to go back and start the Parker series over from the beginning. There's a good use of my time. All right, guys. You guys take it easy. The pseudo White Rocket's going to get out of here for another time. But be sure to check out whiterocketbooks.com. Check out our podcast if you haven't already. And, of course, if you're seeing this on Patreon and you're one of our supporters, thank you so much. That would include, I always want to make sure I mention our patrons, Nicholas Cottrell, Phil Amthor of We Have Donuts, hey, David Medinas, Mark Squire, Dave Powell, Jared Albrecht, Rich Reimer, Michael Kirshner, Bill Matthews, Joey Miller, and Matthew Wagstaff. All you guys are so appreciated. If you're not a supporter yet, please go to patreon.com/Van Allen Plexico. And even for as little as $1 a month, you can help us do more things like this and podcasts and comics and books and stuff. So get out of here for another episode. We'll see you guys down the road.